Welcome to the show, Amy.
Hello.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program. Joining me from, Vancouver, which traditionally Vancouver and Melbourne, they've gone toe to toe for the world's most livable city. But I think during COVID, that just goes out the window, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So we're here to talk all about heartbreak, loss, rejection, navigating life's less pleasant emotions. And of course, you're the founder of Breakup Bootcamp, a bootcamp that you founded back in 2016 to help people heal from heartache. But as I know, reading your bio, you're the daughter of tiger parents. You know, you had it put in your head that you need to be a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant growing up. And you did to some degree pursue that corporate track. And I imagine you never set out to be a heart hacker, if you will. So what happened?
Great question. Yeah. So when I was young, I was on path of being a lawyer or something my parents approved of. And I spent most of my career in marketing, but I went through a pretty traumatic breakup when I was living in Vancouver. I was dating someone who I thought was going to be my happily forever after. And back then I thought I was living the dream, which meant date, get married, your whole future set. And that relationship ended pretty abruptly due to infidelity. And when it did, I completely fell apart. I put so much of my identity in him and us and our future that without it, I didn't know who I was. And so I spiraled into depression. I had panic attacks. I had thoughts of suicide. It was really dark. And along the way of my healing journey, I just tried everything. Therapy, Reiki, energy healing, yoga retreats. And while these things were helping a little bit, there wasn't one place where I could go where there was actually the type of expertise I needed that could deal with a broken heart. And I was getting a lot of bad advice, such as just get over it. Everything happens for a reason, which made things worse. And so after I came out onto the other side, I recognized that there's a need. And I came up with the idea of creating a breakup bootcamp.
Fantastic. And you've since put thousands of people through this boot camp. You've been featured in a lot of top publications. Most recently, I saw you were in a gift pack for people who are suffering from a broken heart. At least your book was, not you, in the New York Times. And that's all of your work over the past 5 years or half a decade has culminated in Breakup Bootcamp, The Science of Rewiring Your Heart, which is your brand new book, which came out back in December. So congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
So one thing you did touch on there when recounting what led to the founding of Renew Breakup Bootcamp was your identity was totally wrapped up in this relationship. And, as someone who's an entrepreneur, I see this not only with people when it comes to their relationships, but it can be their businesses, it can be their identity as a musician, a comedian, whatever the case is. And now with COVID, so much of people's livelihoods could be taken away from them and their identity and entire worldview comes crashing down. So I guess the question for me is how much of our heartache when we're suffering from a breakup comes from a lack of, say, self-love and a lack of being enough without this person, without this business, without this profession?
Great question. I think that one of the greatest lessons you learn from heartbreak, whether it's grieving romantic loss or financial loss or business loss, is that it can help you gain perspective on how much of your wholeness and sense of identity and sense of okayness was based on something completely external. And we only have so much control over it, right? Because a global pandemic might happen, infidelity might come up. And what you're left with is this realization that if you don't become your own internal source of peace and joy and resilience, it's inevitable that you are going to have some sort of a crash, right? Because these things are all outside of our control. And so when it comes to heartbreak, who gets it the hardest? In the research and in my experience, it's typically those who have what's called an anxious attachment style. meaning from a very young age, they have a fear of abandonment and rejection. And they almost, as a child, cling on to their primary caregiver as a way of feeling safe and okay. And this relationship dynamic transfers when they grow up into the romantic partner. And it causes a lot of separation distress. So 90% of the people who I work with at Renew Breakup Bootcamp have an anxious attachment style. They also have a tendency to be more codependent. So they put a lot of their sense of self-worth, their validation based on their partner. So once you take that person out of the equation, they don't know who they are, and they struggle the most when it comes to heartbreak.
It reminds me of something the psychologist Scott Kaufman said, which is we're all just running around playing out our unresolved childhood traumas with each other as adults.
Totally.
And on attachment styles, so we've got anxious, the other two were avoidance and secure, right? So, and that again comes back to the experiences you've had as a child. Like, for example, if your parents were always there for you, perhaps not too much, because if they're overbearing, then that is likely to make you avoidant as an adult, right? Because you want that freedom because you didn't have it as a child. Whereas if they're neglecting you, they're never there, well, then you become anxious because you're afraid that the next person is just going to leave you and not be there for you like your parents were. Is that more or less?
Yeah, the theory is around age 2, we develop an attachment system, which will pretty much determine how we relate romantically as adults. And they're secure, which is about 50% of the population. They're not afraid of intimacy. They're also not codependent. They're able to communicate their needs and their boundaries. Now, then there's the anxious, which I talked about. They fear that they're going to be abandoned. This is usually the result of inconsistent caregiving when the primary caregiver wasn't attuned to the child's needs, and sometimes was there, but sometimes wasn't. So what happens is it trains a child to not know, like, am I going to get fed? Am I going to get these needs met? And to them, it's a matter of survival. Then there's an avoidant attachment style where the coping mechanism of dealing with, I'm going to either get smothered from my parent or I'm going to be disappointed anyway, is I'm just going to not attach. And that makes up around 20 to 25% of the population. And their inherent fear is that intimacy will equate a loss of freedom and autonomy.
Right. So I imagine someone who has an avoidant attachment style then shouldn't hook up with someone who's secure, because that secure person's going to be like, screw this, I'm out of here.
Yeah, well, actually what happens is the anxious is typically drawn to the avoidant and vice versa because they both validate each other's worldview. Now, if you have a secure attachment style, you might be able to weather the storms of someone who's insecurely attached, whether they're anxious or avoidant. And our attachment system, it's a spectrum. It depends on the person you're with. It depends on your life situation. I've met people who, before the pandemic, for example, they're secure, maybe slightly anxious. And then the pandemic hits, they lose their job, they lose their sense of community. The person they're dating moves across the country, and suddenly they become hardcore, extremely anxious attachment style. And so it really does depend on the situation. And I like to look at it as a great framework to help you understand why you might feel and behave the way that you do. But I also caution people who are quick to be like, I'm this label. And then they almost kind of, they identify with it and they do things to kind of stay within that identity.
So with 90% of your bootcamp participants being anxious, I imagine you've done a lot of work with these people and you've learned myriad ways to heal their hearts. But with this going back to childhood, like these are ingrained patterns, behaviors, unconscious behaviors that they've grown up with. I mean, what do we do to change their worldview? Because for some of these women that come to your boot camps, they've been walking around with this worldview for maybe 30 years, thinking they're not good enough, thinking people are going to be there, not be there, unsure about it, and developing these anxious tendencies. Because obviously there's things like inner child work and things with that persuasion, but what kind of things do you do with people who are anxious to help them become a little bit more secure in their love life?
Yeah. So for those listening who might identify with anxious or avoidant, the good news is you actually can shift your attachment style. And the research shows around 20% of people do. They change their attachment style through time. I am personally, I used to be anxiously attached. I'm now what's called an earn secure. I recognize that my anxious attachment style was causing a lot of sabotage in my relationships. And I really set out to shift it. And so part of what we can do is not looking just at your romantic relationships, but your entire tribe. So who are you exposed to? And I would actually just create a list of the people who fall in the low safety, medium safety, and high safety. Low safety are the people you feel judged. You don't know if they're going to be around. They're inconsistent. And what's happening is the people we're exposed to is actually wiring our brain. It's influencing our brain. So if you're constantly around people where you feel are low safety, and this could be from your roommate, to your mother-in-law, to your boss, you're actually not developing the necessary neural pathways for trust and healthy connection. And so I would look at that and increase your exposure to high safety relationships. That might mean you need to put in a bit more effort to spend more time with those people. And then you lower your exposure to the low safety relationships. That's one thing. And that's going to take time. It's not something that can happen overnight. The second thing is to learn how to manage the reaction that happens when you feel that emotion. So when that anxiety hits, what happens is the person goes into this stage of, I'm in survival mode. It's fight or flight. Your nervous system is activated. You're flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. And, we need to actually allow that stress cycle to complete itself, right? Because back in the day, if you were faced with a lion, that's a threat to survival, right? You're getting that chemical reaction in your body. But then you would figure out that, okay, maybe you're not in danger, and you would run, you would move your body, and then you would calm down. Now, in our present day, it might not be a lion, but it might be, I didn't receive a text message back in time, right? But your body is still having the same reaction of like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to survive. So what you want to do in that moment is, instead of reacting by, text messaging 20 times or showing up at their doorstep, these are things I might have done before, you want to actually shake it out. I would say put on a timer for 2 minutes, shake your body from head to toe. This will allow the stress chemicals to metabolize. And doing things like meditation and mindfulness will help you slow down the reaction time. And then also identify when you're creating that story. For example, someone who's anxiously attached, they're triggered, they don't hear back from a text message. Their mind might automatically go and create a story of, I'm going to be abandoned, they don't like me anymore. And again, that's your amygdala, just your fear processing that's going off. So if you can find ways to self-soothe and then slow down your response time, then that can help you actually change your behavior. And through time and through practice, this actually makes a huge difference.
And it sounds like what we're talking about there is moving away from identifying too closely with these emotions and thoughts as they appear, and creating a layer of separation between us and them. Reminds me of a book by Beth Curlin called Walking on the Tightrope. I'm not sure if you've read it, but she basically says, notice the emotions, welcome them curiously, watch them, don't judge them. And when you do that, it creates that layer of difference between yourself and these emotions, and it makes them softer in a way. And something you point to in your book is that the physiological lifespan of an emotion is about 90 seconds. But why does it feel like, for some of us, these emotions can not last 90 seconds, but last 90 minutes?
Right. Or 90 days or 90 years, right?
Yeah.
It's those stories we attach. So instead of feeling, oh, I feel sadness, okay, it's going to pass through me like a wave, or maybe crying to release, the mind goes and creates a story and judges. I'm so stupid for feeling sad. Oh, why did I do this? I shouldn't have sent that text message. And then you layer on story after story, and then that emotion gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then there's what I call feeding the emotional monster, where it's like emotional cutting. You then put on Coldplay Fix You on repeat. You then watch Love Actually. Then your body language is hunched over in fetal position. And all these things makes that emotional monster get bigger and bigger and stay around longer and longer.
And with respect to these emotions, and it's something you point to in your book, and I guess this goes back to, Eastern philosophy, but just sitting with emotions, the only way out is through, essentially. And one thing in the West, or one thing we tend to do in the West, is that we will either suppress our emotions. We're told to be strong, to not let things get to us. Or like you said, when I asked you about how the bootcamp came about, oh, you'll be fine, just get over it. What do they say? The best way to get over someone is to get under someone else. Like, this is all flawed advice. But and the other thing we do other than suppress is escape, right? So we'll drink, we'll go and party, we'll do drugs, we'll sleep with someone else, we'll get buried in our work, whatever the case is. The one thing that perhaps we don't hear enough people telling us to do is to just feel the emotions, like sit with the emotions. And I mean, I'll ask you this question, but what is the benefit of actually sitting with our emotions and feeling them, as opposed to suppressing them or trying to escape them?
Yeah, great question. Our emotions need air to breathe. The pain needs oxygen to breathe. And when we do things like suppressing them or avoiding them, or, getting on Tinder and distracting ourselves from it, it's not that the emotion and the pain goes away. It just stays within you. And then it leaks out, either slowly over here and over there, or what I have found with a lot of clients is it comes back with a vengeance in either the next relationship or in regret. And so you're going to deal with it now, or you're going to deal with it later. And by actually taking an approach where you have compassion with your emotions, instead of judging them as good or bad or right or wrong, and that they just are, it's a part of the human experience. It helps you have a more compassion with yourself. And it's so interesting how in North America, if you break your leg, it's so obvious. You go to the doctor, you might put a cast on it, you rest, and you kind of take care of your leg. You don't go out and run a marathon. But when it comes to matters of the heart, there's a completely different mentality of like, suck it up, don't cry, don't show emotion, it's bad, don't be weak. Oh, what an asshole, right? But instead of allowing the time and the space to let that broken heart heal and then learn from that, it's like, let's go run a marathon right away. It's the actual equivalent of saying, pipe up, run a marathon when you have a broken leg. It makes absolutely no sense. We need to treat matters of the heart the same way as we would treat a broken leg. And that's with empathy, it's with kindness and with compassion. And whenever someone is going through all of it, the ups and the downs, I say to them, you're just expanding your emotional range.
Yeah, totally. And, one thing I've found to be helpful in that space is just labeling your emotions and, oh, hey, Mr. Sadness, hey, Mr. Guilty, like whatever the case is. And going back to what I was touching on a bit earlier, like just creating that level of separation, but it's also showing up for your emotions, the positive, quote unquote, positive emotions and quote unquote, negative emotions, and just embracing all of them, as opposed to seeing these negative emotions as being inherently bad and something we should not feel as human beings, and something that make us less worthwhile because we should be stronger, because that's what our parents told us growing up, that we need to be strong. So yeah.
You touched on a great point, which is not identifying with emotion. So when you feel sad, and this is just a small tip that can actually make a big difference, instead of saying, I am sad, you can create some separation by saying, I am feeling the emotion of sadness. And it might seem so insignificant, but over time, the semantics do matter. The words do matter. And instead of you identify as being the emotion, you start to create some separation and understand that you are not the emotion and you are experiencing it versus being it.
Yeah. Words are so powerful. I had this conversation with a friend the other day, and he's going through a bit of a crisis of identity when it comes to entrepreneurship. And he's like, I want to be doing more for the world. I don't want to be all about myself. But what is life if I don't achieve? And I said, well, what if you just change the word achievement with contribution? It's a simple tweak when it comes to how you perceive your work, but it's about serving others now. It's not just about you achieving things and getting more, more medals and whatnot, so to speak. So
I love that.
Yeah, words are just so powerful. So when you were talking about looking for places to seek guidance and counsel on healing your own broken heart, Amy, you said there was nothing there that was really like all that substantial. And one thing that I did quite like about your book is it does combine a lot of Eastern sort of spirituality with a lot of Western psychology. And one thing we learn is that love, those feel-good chemicals we feel when we first meet someone, and those chemicals that perhaps keep us yearning for someone after they're gone, is not all that different to perhaps what a drug addict might go through to some degree. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so they've done some studies on people who were newly separated, and they put them through an fMRI machine. And what they found was the same part of the brain that lit up was associated with the same parts of the brain as when a drug user is fiending for their next fix. So you're literally in withdrawal. And if you think about it, when you are first in the falling in love stage, the romance stage, there's a lot of dopamine, right? Which is the motivational chemical. And it can also make you super obsessive over someone and have your rose tinted glasses, and it feels amazing. And when you think about a breakup, it's the same chemicals happening, just in reverse. And it is completely normal, especially when you've gone from being super connected and intimate with someone, and now suddenly it's gone. You might know on a cognitive level that there's been a separation, but your body doesn't. It doesn't understand. It's in a state of shock. It's going, what the hell is going on? Give me those chemicals. And that's going to cause you to want to scroll down memory lane and look at old text messages, or contact your ex, or scroll their social media feed. It's your brain that's craving those chemicals. So when you're aware of what's happening in the brain and the body, that might help you think, oh, I'm actually not going crazy. This is normal and it will pass.
Yeah. And that points to some of the research you talk about in your book, which is these withdrawal cravings last about 10 to 20 minutes. And that is typically when you text someone, or maybe send them a bouquet of flowers. Not that I've done that in the past, but yeah, like you said earlier, you just getting physical during those moments rather than feeling that emotion too closely. Like you say, do some push-ups or whatever the case is. That will get that energy out of your body, and you'll be able to have a little bit more agency over your behavior rather than just succumbing to that withdrawal craving.
Yeah. So dealing with withdrawal there is a way you can. And the challenge is when you're going through a withdrawal, you don't think it's ever going to end. And I've been trying this thing where whenever I feel an itch, and I'm mindful of this practice, I will feel the itch. I'm like, the itch is not going to go away. And listeners can try this. Next time you feel itch, just be like, okay, sit there with the itch. And you're like, I need to scratch it because it's not going to go away. But when you can then do something to get your mind off that track, right? Do a state change, shake your body, do jumping jacks, go look around you and list all the things you're grateful for. That helps you get into the present moment. You'll find you'll eventually forget that there was that itch. And then later on, you'll be like, oh my gosh, I did that thing. And so you can actually start and do that, and you'll see the power that you have over your mind, that you can actually redirect your focus. The same thing happens when you're craving texting or contacting your ex. Give yourself 20 minutes. Do something that's a state change, and eventually it becomes easier and easier to direct your focus to a place that's more healthy for you.
Yeah. And even just sitting with those emotions, like we said earlier, like being comfortable with, hey, I'm feeling this now, but that doesn't mean I need to do something about it. Like, yes, we can shift our attention, or maybe we just get comfortable with that feeling and not being a victim of it, and just being, hey, that's part of me. I see you, but hey, I know you're trying to look out for me, but I've got it from here.
Yeah.
So what about for people who perhaps they have traditionally been in relationships that might be construed as toxic, and that for them has become kind of like their baseline level of emotional well-being, if you will, like the state of, what do they call it, homeostasis. I mean, what can you tell me about people who seek out that sort of state, even though it is to the detriment of their long-term happiness?
Yeah. So there's something called attractions of deprivation. And this is when we are drawn to people who can wound us in a very similar way to how we were wounded as children. Our psyche tries to recreate the scenario of the crime in an attempt to change its ending. And so if you had a father who was unavailable, and that became what you were used to, you're trying to always earn their love and their attention. This was exactly what happened with me. What happens is that becomes your homeostasis, the state of anxiety or not feeling enough. And then you'll reach out for partners that can actually repeat that exact same emotional experience. And this is where people get confused, because they'll say, well, Amy, no, the people are totally different. This person was 6 feet tall. This person was, totally different from another country, whatever it is. But I then ask them, okay, what were the main emotions you felt in the last relationship and the relationship after that and the one after that? And then circle, what is the emotion that keeps popping up? And typically what we'll find is a thread, and an emotional experience keeps repeating, because we try to create that. And then we're like, okay, well, maybe if I'm just useful enough, maybe if I fix them enough, then I'll earn that love that I never got. And this is a common trap. And this is what creates what I call a broken chemistry compass. People constantly think, I'm broken. No, you're not broken, but your chemistry compass might be. And that is our internal GPS that points us into the direction of who we're drawn to and who we're repulsed by. So if you've grown up with inconsistency, with an unhealthy model of what love looks like and feels like, chances are your GPS system is going to point you in the direction of people that are going to create that same experience for you.
Yeah, I think it was Sigmund Freud who said something along those lines, where he said one of the best things a parent can do for a child is just to show them an ample amount of love growing up, because that's just going to change their relationship with people when they are adults and how they relate to the world around them. And they're not going to think that they're not enough, and therefore do things to validate that broken ego or broken sense of self.
Yeah. And I think in a perfect world that could happen, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that you had evil parents or that they were like evilly intentioned. Sometimes they're dealing with their trauma from when they grew up, or they're in a lot of stress, or maybe one parent's an alcoholic or lost their job, and they're misattuned to the needs and the cues of their child. And so I think that's also important to differentiate. It doesn't mean that your parents were awful, but it does help you have some understanding on why you might choose the people you choose and stay in toxic relationships.
Yeah. And that's where compassion really comes back into it, right? Like even compassion for our parents, because they were doing the best they could with the tools and resources they had at their disposal. It's like, in your case, your parents came from that particular type of culture. They moved to North America essentially to pursue a better life, and for them, ethos of like hard work and achievement, that's what it was all about. And that's not too dissimilar to like what I experienced. My parents moved from Eastern Europe out to Australia in search of a better life, and then you're told to get educated, work hard, and all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, even though it's absolutely not their intention, you start to develop this complex where you think, well, unless I do these things, unless I get that degree, unless I get that 6-figure corporate job, then I'm a failure and I'm not good enough and I'm going to let down my parents. So, but I absolutely, definitely need to make that distinction between they're doing their best. They are not bad people. So in the West, Amy, over the last, say, 100 years, especially with the rise of popular culture, television, movies, music, we've developed these idealized versions of what love is, the rise of romanticism, if you will, which I think you hit on this in your book, but it seems like for a lot of people, unless you feel like you found a unicorn who poops rainbow flavored or rainbow colored gelato, they're not good enough. I mean, what's your view on romanticism, and has it been good or not so good for love?
The fairy tales, am I frozen or is that okay?
I think you froze for a second.
Okay, I'm good now.
Yeah.
The fairy tales, the love stories, the love songs have completely screwed a generation of people when it comes to love, because it creates these completely unrealistic expectations of what love and relationships mean, right? Look at Romeo and Juliet. They knew each other for 24 hours and they killed themselves for love. And that's like the OG love story that we were indoctrinated with since we were young. And so a lot of these love stories, whether you're conscious of it or not, you're absorbing these messages because they're repeated at you over and over again. And they are not realistic. And it's really more showing you love addiction, codependency, limerence. And so it's important to understand that there's two main stages of love. There's passionate love, which is what we see in the movies. And this is very dopamine driven. It's future oriented. It's exhilarating. And on average, this lasts between 12 to 18 months. The relationship and the love then evolves into the next stage, which is companionate love. And now different chemicals take the lead, such as oxytocin and serotonin. These are the present, here and now chemicals, which allow you to appreciate the present moment and be present with what you have, appreciating what you have. And this is a very normal and organic transition. But if you're not aware of this and you think that love is about, you look across the room and you want to just rip off their clothes every time you see them, even though you've been married for 10 years and had 3 kids, you're going to be wildly disappointed and you're going to think there's something wrong. But what happens is in the beginning, you have all these love drugs. It's like Mother Nature's way of giving you that momentum so that you'll actually get together and not see all their flaws and toss it out the window. And then after a while, Mother Nature needs a break and you can't just rely on the momentum anymore. And that's when you actually need to make an effort and you have to connect with intention. You need to spark desire and passion with intention. And we need to have more realistic expectations and standards of what it takes to create a long-lasting, committed relationship, because it's definitely not what we've been sold in the movies.
And on the flip side of that, Amy, I mean, for people who perhaps say that, well, I just can't meet anyone I really vibe with. I never meet someone who I'm just feeling that spark with from the first date. Is that something that they can instead look to develop with someone, like get to that companionate love without feeling that spark from the very get-go?
Yes. So we are constantly feeling chemistry with people, and some of it we have no control over. It's pheromones. We're actually predisposed to be drawn to people who are genetically dissimilar to us. And that is helpful because if you ever feel like you've been rejected, there's a part that there's no way, right? It's genetics. Like you can't do anything about it. And so when it comes to romantic partners, there is this emphasis that there needs to be this 10 out of 10, I see you, I want to rip off your clothes. But that's actually not reality. All you want to look at and see is if there's a connection. So on the first date, or even second date, all you want to see is, am I having fun? Do I want to see this person again? Because your brain might not cognitively process what type of connection that is. Is it platonic connection or is it romantic chemistry? And that can actually take time to be determined. There's something called the mere exposure effect, where the very fact of being around someone, being exposed to them regularly, will amplify the root feeling. So if there was that little bit of connection, which you might not know if it's romantic or sexual or not, but there was a connection, through time, it's going to grow that. But if it was disgust, then through time, it's just going to keep amplifying the original emotion of disgust.
Right. Interesting. It's a little bit like psychedelics. Whatever you feel going into it is what's going to get amplified. But
yes.
with the exposure side of things. So a lot of people, and I've definitely explored or experienced this and discussed this with my friends, but sometimes that familiarity side of things, we kind of look down at that and say, oh, the spark isn't there. I think it's just familiarity. We've been together for so long. And we tend to say, well, like that's not an idealized version of what our relationship should be. But at the same time, it sounds like perhaps, again, words matter rather than familiarity. Perhaps it's something else that we use in that space. But I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but essentially I like being comfortable with someone, having had that exposure to them, being familiar with them knowing your life, you knowing their life. Like these aren't necessarily bad things. I mean, this is just life in a way.
Yeah, but it can wreak havoc on the desire and passion department.
Yes.
The great news is you can actually do things to change this. Mm-hmm. So like I mentioned, in the passionate stage of early love and early romance, it's very dopamine driven. It's about, this is what I want. This is what I see in the future and I want it. And I'm motivated to get it, right? Maybe it's ice cream. Oh, I want ice cream. I'm motivated. I get that dopamine that's going to motivate me to go put on pants and go to store, get the ice cream. But then after I have the second and third ice cream, I'm not getting a surge of dopamine anymore. So with relationships, what sparks that dopamine, right? That sparks the desire is novelty. So introducing new things. That's why you might find that when you go on a vacation, it's somewhere you don't know, those sparks of desire comes back again. Learning something new together, taking space apart. I actually do something called Independent Thursdays, where every Thursday, my partner and I take the entire day. We do not eat together. We really limit conversations unless it's like something we have to talk about. But the things I want to tell him, I'm like, oh, I did this cool podcast today. I hold it and I save it. We intentionally create some space, especially since this pandemic, when we're around each other all the time. It kills desire, right? So create intentionally some mystery, some space, and then come back together intentionally the day after, and then tell them and share, oh, this is what I learned. Get to know them again, ask questions, be curious. But if you don't create that, then yeah, you're familiar, you know everything about them, and it can get really dull. And so it doesn't matter if it's been 5 months or 5 years or 5 kids in, you can look at your partner with new eyes. You can create, show different parts of yourselves. You can continue to evolve and bring that back into the relationship and create space to come back together.
Yeah. I think Esther Perel said something along those lines in Mating in Captivity as well, where she basically says you need mystery to maintain intimacy and excitement in the relationship. Otherwise, if you have, like what I've seen on Facebook, people have shared Facebook profiles and things of that persuasion where they've just kind of morphed into one entity, that novelty, that mystery, that unknown elements to the relationship, which makes someone attractive, which makes you drawn to them, that just withers away. So like you really need to actively work at maintaining that sense of self, of separateness in a relationship to maintain that excitement. Otherwise, yeah, it's just not really going to be conducive to long-term sparks and desire.
Yeah. And Steve, you just said it, right? When we merge, and that is a very tempting for some people to do. Like for me, I could merge with my partner. I could be around my partner 24 hours a day. But what happens is, again, yes, you lose your own identity and your identity becomes the we. And that also sets you up for if something was to happen to the relationship. That's me circa, 9 years ago when I completely fell apart.
Yeah.
And so you're really setting yourself up for failure if something was to happen to the relationship, because you've now identified with the we.
No, totally. I think that's a fantastic point. One other thing worth exploring, one other aspect of relationships worth exploring when it comes to our idealized expectations is something you touch on in your book, which is relationships are a bridge to our future self. Oftentimes, I think we go into relationships expecting it to work, and if it doesn't work, it's a failure, as opposed to seeing it as a bridge to our future self. We're going to learn from that relationship. We're going to develop as human beings, and we're going to grow. And I think Nietzsche also said something about friendship along those lines, where he said friendship is like ships in the night. They might cross paths, they might travel along the same route for a little while, but they'll ultimately end up at different ports. And that's okay. And rather than looking back on the relationship as quote unquote failure, looking back on it as, hey, I learned something from this. I grew as a person and I can be better for the next person. Like, I think that's such a beautiful thing.
Yeah. And Steve, you explain a growth mindset.
Mm.
And when you look at the relationship as a bridge to the next, whether it's a bridge to another relationship, a bridge to you, a wiser version of yourself, relationships, how can I say this? Relationships don't fail. They only fail when you don't try and you don't learn. And so sometimes we actually need to get into relationships to actually figure out what we don't want, to make space for what we do want. And so I say that. And so each relationship is like a bridge. And what you want to avoid is crossing that same bridge over and over again. When you don't learn the lesson, you just keep repeating it. But the destination, people generally think that it's, love with another person. No, then the destination the entire time has been a journey of your evolution. Our partners aren't here to make us happy. No one can actually make you happy. Our partners are not here to make us happy. Our partners are here to help us become more conscious.
Yeah, definitely excelling to a higher level of consciousness indeed. With something you touched on there, which was sometimes you need to let go of someone to create space in your life for someone else who's perhaps more in line with what you actually want. But I guess there's a fine line between just jumping from one person to the next, never really doing the work, versus consciously saying, okay, this isn't for me and I need to find someone else. So some people might find themselves confused by those two sort of worldviews. Like, do the work, quit. What do I do? Like, what's your advice for people who are kind of in that camp?
I think it's important to reflect on if it is a phase or if it's a chronic pattern. And if you are in a dead end relationship. So if you're holding on to the relationship because of fear that you'll be alone, and if you're in a relationship, if there's any abuse at all, 100% you get out, whether it's emotional or physical abuse. But if you're in a dead end relationship where there is no evolution, there is no growth, then you need to ask yourself the hard questions. And no one can give you that answer, right? Should I stay or should I go? It's a very personal question. And it's going to be based on a few different things, from what's your value sets? Do you value commitment and working at it more than you value your peace of mind? And I'll look at my mom and dad. They've been together for over 40 years. It's a pretty toxic, codependent relationship, but they value tradition. They do not believe in divorce. And that supersedes everything else. They didn't live to optimize for happiness and live your best life and follow your dreams. They're in a completely different era. So I think we need to consider those things as well. And the same piece of advice is not going to go and make sense for everyone.
Totally. And I think with your parents' worldview, I think that just speaks to a lot of this, or it speaks to kind of like the Buddhist worldview, which is happiness or attachment to desire is the root of suffering. Like, we always want more. We're always comparing our world with what should be, as opposed to accepting what is. Or I guess another way of looking at that is happiness is expectations minus reality. And with whatever the case is, like if it's your parents' expectations or someone else with a totally different worldview, but if your expectations are where they are and your reality meets that, well, that is happiness. And it's also G2 Krishnamurti, one of my favorite writers, an Indian teacher who did a lot of work on spirituality, basically said, look, a lot of suffering just comes back to seeking out what should be. And that's usually based on programming that we've been brought up with, that we've adopted from our peers, from society, from Instagram, and not accepting what is. And if we just get more comfortable accepting what is, and that includes accepting ourselves, not just our external circumstances, then we can move forward with a lot more inner peace. And that doesn't mean that we stop like becoming something. We can still become something, but while just being 100% there on that journey. I don't know, that's a very difficult thing, but it's a simple but very profound shift in how we approach our lives, I think.
Yeah, it's a difference between this one track, which is very popular in North America right now, which is chasing happiness, and instead chasing, well, not chasing, instead of chasing happiness, walking the journey of acceptance.
Yes.
And that's when the good or bad, it's not good or bad. It is something that happens.
It just is. Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like what Viktor Frankl wrote in Man's Search for Meaning. Happiness should not be pursued. It must ensue out of everything you do. So I did mention Jitu Krishnamurti a second ago. So I've got a quote here from him on love, and I wanted to get your thoughts. The quote is attachment love? Does attachment breed fear, jealousy, and anxiety? You're attached because of your insufficiency and loneliness. Out of your insufficiency, loneliness, and sense of lacking, you cling to another. Where there is attachment, there is no love. What are your thoughts?
Wow, that's complex. Well, the way that I perceive that quote, if it comes to relationships, it is natural for us to attach. When we were young children, we had to attach to our parents or our primary caregiver, or we would die. And so to say that, well, you're not evolved enough, or you shouldn't be attaching to another person, I don't think is rooted in reality. If I'm perceiving that quote correctly, I think that yes, attachment is love. Love is attachment. And our partners is where we find our safety and our home base. And I don't think that that's a negative or weak or bad thing.
Yeah. I think it's, and that's the thing about quotes and mantras is oftentimes they are convenient and that they make for good coffee mugs and things of that persuasion, but sometimes they don't stand up to empirical testing. And there's so many different ways to look at things. And again, that's one of the good things about your book. It's not just full of mantras and woo. It's actually grounded in a lot of science, which is really, really good to see. So where to from here? Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to touch on today. But I guess we've kind of explored this topic, like the words you use are very powerful, but reframing like ultimately what happens to us. And that more or less aligns with this whole concept of growth mindset. Like just, relationship ends, let's just accept it for what it is and take the learnings out of it and move forward. Like reframing is just so powerful with anything we essentially pursue. And I guess now with the pandemic, so many relationships are coming undone. And a lot of people are perhaps having to reframe their worldview, their experiences of life right now. And, we did talk about creating distance between ourselves and our partner to maintain that intimacy and excitement, particularly for people who are perhaps in lockdown at different parts of the world, it was in each other's face 24/7. That can create a lot of tension for people. So aside from, well, I mean, in this case, you can't even create that distance because you're in each other's face every day. But what do you propose for people who are struggling with the pandemic and it is having essentially a toll in their relationships?
I think one of the things that we can do is learn how to fight well. And before the pandemic, you might have been able to get away with having really oppositional communication and conflict management styles because there's travel, there's busyness, but now we're in each other's faces. And this is the best time to learn it. And I like to look at conversations as, are you going in with boxing gloves or a handshake? And boxing gloves is when you are using accusatory language, when you choose timing, that's terrible. I like love to spring on these deep emotional talks at like midnight when my partner's about to fall asleep. It's horrible. I've now learned not to do that. That's boxing gloves. When you judge or you try to control or you demand, what happens is the other person receiving that, their nervous system gets activated and they automatically start secreting cortisol and adrenaline, and the blood flow starts to move through their body to prepare them for fight or flight. And then their amygdala is running the show. The prefrontal cortex, the part that's logical and rational, takes a step back. So you've already lost the conversation before it's begun. And so get really skilled by practicing how to go in with a handshake. And that is the language you use. So instead of saying, you do this, say, I feel sad when. It is validating the other person's emotional experience. If they feel sad or mad, like, you can't feel angry. Like, why you so pissed off? Instead, it's like, I understand that you're upset, and I can see why there might have been confusion. It's a really different approach, leading with curiosity versus judgment. All these approaches are using the handshake. And then you actually have an opportunity for two functional adults to have a conversation and move forward. But otherwise, you're either one or two wounded children fighting it out, and it's not going to go anywhere. So I think that is one of the silver linings, is you can actually learn how to do this, and you can have a conversation before a high stakes conversation happens, being like, what is our current conflict style? Do I like to connect right away and make amends and have harmony, or do I need space? And typically there's a difference. There's usually one person who wants more connection and harmony right away, and there's one person who wants more space. And talk about it. Okay, this is my style, this is your style. What's a collaborative approach so the next time we can actually have a more harmonious conversation? And you might agree, like, okay, we agree that for 30 minutes, we take time apart. And in that time apart, we do our own thing, we journal, we work out, whatever it is. And then we come back together and then we check in, right? You have to figure out a strategy that works for you. I think that is one of the things. The second thing is intentionally creating times for separation and coming back together. And you can still do this even if you live in the same apartment and you're, you see each other. It just means you're not engaging in conversation constantly. You find creative ways to create some sort of separation and space so that you can come back apart together.
Yeah. And having those sort of rituals kind of reminds me of Marshall and Lily in How I Met Your Mother. They used to do this thing where they'd say pause when they were fighting. I don't know if it was really a good thing, because it ultimately meant that they just kept pushing back the important conversation and never actually addressing it. But and I think something you're pointing to there as well is just identifying each other's triggers as well. Like for your partner, it could be, hey, don't engage me on deep and meaningful conversations at midnight when I'm about to fall asleep after a long day of work and everything else. So, and just being more cognizant of those patterns and behaviors that our partners have, I think is so powerful. But Amy, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed chatting with you. If people want to learn more about you, where's the best place to go?
Yeah. So my website's renewbreakupbootcamp.com. I'm on Instagram at Miss Amy Chan, and my book's available at bookstores.
Fantastic. Well, we'll add all of your social links and the link to the book to the show notes for our listeners. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.